Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. There is increasing concern in the United States and in Western countries about the aggressive activities and the wide-ranging impact of China's efforts to conduct cyber theft and telecom thefts. And the most prominent examples of that in recent days has been the hacking of more than 500 million users of the Marriott hotel chain database. At the same time, the arrest of a very high-profile Chinese CFO of the Huawei company, which has a massive turnover and has the blessings of the Chinese government, has created very clearly the lines that are now being drawn between the West and China in terms of cyber security and the theft of technology. Back home in India, also, the government has issued notices to about 60 Chinese who are working in certain companies in the western region of India, and though they are here on tourist visas, they have been seen to be working quite closely in terms of technology and cyber technology efforts of the company to make products. To what extent this is part of a bigger Chinese design, and to what extent India could become also a victim of China's agenda to have complete control over the cyber elements of our society, this discussion will show us. We have two experts with us. We have Mr. Jiten Jain, the CEO of Indian InfoSec Consortium, I believe a consortium of hundreds of experts who look at cyber threat, and they are obviously very well informed on a variety of cyber issues, and we look to have your views. And we have once again my friend, Professor Pant of King's College London, Professor of War Studies, and here currently in India with the ORF as a Distinguished Fellow. So, Jiten, I want to ask you that in China, what choices do companies have when they indulge in acts which the West clearly sees as theft, espionage, or whatever, when Chinese legislation make it mandatory under the national intelligence law for Chinese companies to have involvement with the state's agenda and do as they are told, obviously, otherwise they go out of business?
Well, I mean, it's not only there in China, it's there in the West also. So if you take the example of America, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA court orders, or if you talk about Chinese, I mean, if you talk about Huawei itself, the example you cited in the opening remarks, I mean, it's very well written in their agreement that, the data of the users will be transferred to a jurisdiction outside where the services or equipment of Huawei is being provided. And the laws of the jurisdiction may be different, or laws or data protection law may not even exist. What this essentially means is that no matter where you are in the world, if you're using a Huawei product, any sort of data passing through those Huawei products or stored in those Huawei products can be anytime accessed or transferred back to China.
And that makes Indian companies also vulnerable.
That is because of the compliance with the Chinese, laws. Now that makes everyone vulnerable, not only Indian companies, American companies, Western countries, everyone. So and we are living in an era where in last 10 years there is a remarkable success of Huawei by selling affordable consumer gadgetry. They've gone on to become in last year the second largest mobile manufacturer in the world. I mean, if you look at the network of 70 countries in the world, the primary equipment of the core networks is running on Huawei or other Chinese companies' equipments. I mean, these are challenging times.
Okay, I'll come back to you about how the West is now perceiving that, but yes, clearly Huawei has now last year posted a revenue profit of $93 billion or more. Harsh, there is obviously concern in the US now, but do you think the US has woken up too late? Because this has been an ongoing intrusion into the US mind, intellectual, artificial intelligence space and cyberspace for quite some time. And to now say that China is eating into US data for Chinese purposes, has it come because there are certain actions of the Chinese that have begun to hurt the US industry? For instance, the taking away of the designs of one of America's fifth-generation fighter aircrafts.
Absolutely, and I think now they have there is a recognition in Washington that, look, what has happened over the last decade or even longer is that China systematically eroding at the power base of the US. And the ability of the US to be the global superpower in large part relies on its ability to be at the cutting edge of high-end technology. So when you're talking of quantum computing, when you're talking of 5G coming into the mix, when you're talking of AI, you are basically looking at a country that has led in these, led from the front. And now, as you have the Chinese coming into the landscape, eroding at some of these fundamental strengths, they're waking up. And I think partly the waking up had to do with this consensus in the American intellectual establishment that, look, if only China were to integrate into the global international order, it would become like us. The recognition is now that it is not becoming like us. It is challenging virtually every single norm. No, whether you're looking at maritime, whether you're looking at basic human rights norms, whether you're looking at how countries operate their cyberspaces. So I think now that question is out in the open, and the West has recognized the challenge. And the question that you had asked earlier about India, perhaps we are not there yet in terms of recognizing the challenge that the West is now too late to
Or we are
recognize.
just too lazy to innovate and quite happy for the Chinese to do our work.
Yes, I think, well, I don't think we are lazy. I think partly we need to wake up from the slumber because we are always behind the curve, if you will, in terms of the strategic thinking that involves it. How do you prepare yourself for the fourth industrial revolution? Are we preparing ourselves, or are we putting ourselves into these blinkers which will allow some other country to take the opportunities away from us? And I think that's a question our
Jiten,
policymakers
it's exactly the point I was coming to that Harsh has made, that you see the fear in the American establishment is that they've been in the forefront for a long time. But for 10 critical technologically laid out areas that the Chinese have now spelt out for Made in China 2025, a lot of those aims can be achieved only by what an American expert, John Demers, has called by simply robbing, replicating, or replacing. And a classic example of that is that the Chinese have, from nowhere, gone to create the DRAM technology, which is really the kind of technology that the Americans felt that the Chinese and the companies that have been co-opted didn't have. But within a year, suddenly, these technologies appeared on the surface of these companies, which showed the highest end of capability a new company couldn't possibly acquire so quickly.
Well, I mean, it's been happening over last couple of decades. As Professor Pant rightly pointed out, they never wanted to integrate into the world order. They just wanted to get inside and create their own ruckus. I mean, you take the example of Lockheed Martin, or stealing the plans of fifth generation fighter jets, or you take the example of China recently launched a satellite for providing encrypted communications for military domain with quantum cryptography. And if you read the WikiLeaks cable, released 5 years back, they clearly stated out that US has written that China has stolen our entire technology, and which was further developed in the Shanghai University. And China has made much more advancements than US itself by stealing their own technology. So this affordable gadgetry selling across the world, there is now a worldwide conclusion that this is a part of larger nefarious Chinese design of state-sponsored hacking machinery. I think somewhere down the line, our governments have failed to realize that cybersecurity is now becoming an essential part of national security strategy, and we have to ensure that the next war will be fought on the frontiers of technology, not on the conventional battlefields.
Exactly. That's the point we wish to make after break, to look at how cybersecurity could clearly impact on national security, both at the military level, at the planning level, and at the level of our businesses. But that after break. Welcome back. We are looking at the espionage and theft activities of Chinese companies and their ability to reach out right across the world, in the developed world and in countries like India, where they are wanting to carve out a space for themselves, but also having access to some of our most sensitive thinking and our areas. Professor Harsh Pant, I read some time ago a piece, a fairly well-researched piece in an international magazine, in which they talked about that future conflicts are not going to be about aircrafts and tanks rolling off the runways and battlefields, but about how cyber weapon systems and cyber planning could really be the defining point in future conflicts. Two quick questions. One is that going to apply across the board? So are we looking at some kind of impact on defense budgeting and cutting down on forces, but increasing cyber armies? And to what extent are we anywhere near the capabilities that you need to have to deal with the Chinese?
Well, first question is, the answer for the first question is, of course, I think we need some kind of a defense restructuring at a fundamental level. And I think that is a sense you get when you hear our defense leadership talk about, how do you cut the flab, how do you allocate the defense budget in ways in which technology is reinforced. But I think the second point that you make is perhaps very valid in the sense that I don't think there is yet a coherent idea as to what is it that we want to do with the cyber security threat that we have outlined. And do we have a sense of what the threat is coming from? I think the earlier discussion that we were having was that the threat is not going to be very palpable. The threat is not going to be very, something that you can hold on to. Threat is going to be somewhere hidden amongst our, day-to-day appliances and day-to-day utilities. And that is a sense that I think we need to understand what is the debate in the West, what it is about. This is the liberal sphere. And when the liberal sphere is talking about removing China from their midst in terms of ability of China to wield access via its technology, via its access to high-end cutting-edge technology, I think what we need to learn is that why is it that we are not following in that direction? Why is it that we are behind the curve? And why is it some of the questions that are being asked in the West are not still being asked in India? When we are looking at cyber threat, that's the cyber threat we need to be talking about. Of course, it can be very sophisticated, but at the end of the day, the first level of that threat is going to come from the kinds of discussions that we are having right now.
Yeah, I mean, we've been notorious in our military and government establishment for having a sense of abhorrence for intellectual pluralism. The Sahab knows it all, and that's where it rests in his files. But Jiten, I want to ask you with reference to the Marriott data threat. Now, 2 or 3 important points emerge from that. One is that initially when apparently, and now US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has gone on record to say that indications are very clear that the Chinese did the data theft. Why did they do it? 500 million people's data of all sorts were taken, which I'm told, which ranges from passport details to travel details to check-in, check-out date, etc. And interestingly, also there was a hacking of another important department in the US called the Office of Personnel Management. Initially, people thought that this is not an NSA hacking, so we can live with it. But some 22 million people whose data was taken out. And if you come down the percentage levels, and even if you come to 2 million people or whatever, and further filter down, what the Chinese are looking at are very important people whose personal data are available there, such as government personnel, scientists, industrialists, and defense manufacturers. How can China use that data? Because that data has not been put out on the deep dark web for sale. So clearly the Chinese are keeping that data with them to plan, to blackmail, to put pressure on, to pursue their agenda. And to that extent, David Sanger, his latest book called The Perfect Weapon, talks about what Professor Harsh Pant was saying, that cyber threat is the threat you have to gear up for, and not traditional threats that we've been wasting so much of our energy, arguing about.
When we talk about Marriott, you see, it's not the question of data of customers being stolen or credit card numbers being stolen. The very reason that it has not come on dark web, it proves the point that it is of strategic importance and it will never come. It will always be utilized at the back end. And if the data is gone, that proves that the network was compromised. And if the network was compromised, essentially what they have also may have stolen will be the video recordings of the public corridors, who's meeting whom, who's staying with whom, how many times a particular person visits. If you talk about other hacks of Department of US personnel, the data which went was also of the people who were deployed in special forces, undercover agents. So you see, you look at the press release released by the British government and their allies yesterday. They are accusing China of commercial espionage, spread over 5 to 7 years. widening across Europe, British interests, and even in Asian countries, and that they're specific in saying that this was a state-sponsored activity. It was not randomly carried out by some unknown Chinese hackers. There was Chinese military and state security involved in those hacking. Now that is where the entire question, what I believe is that there've been reports of supply chain infection. You see, the personal data of individuals, who's meeting whom, what sort of likes and fantasies they have, what is the weak points they may have. They may be used to compromise individuals to ensure that somewhere down the line, supply chain or the product may be infected. And this is what US British government is saying yesterday. They're calling all the managed service providers and suppliers across UK to say that ensure that when you're buying the products, double verify them, look at the source, look at the origin, because there was a report that China was able to successfully compromise Amazon data centers by infecting the supply chain and provided infected chips. So I think that's where the entire threat is originating. It's not about one particular department being compromised. It's about a larger ecosystem, the dependence being created and using it at the time of war. So the fundamental point I'm trying to make is that we as a country have to ensure that we must do away with these policies of L1 and transparency. When it comes to national security, the data protection has to take the fundamental progress over all these laws we have, and we have to ensure that the new 5G generation networks where we will have all the sensors and everything, Chinese companies are not allowed to participate, not allowed to put directly or indirectly any equipment on the networks, to ensure that at the times of war, our dual-use industries like power grids, telecom networks are not compromised and taken down. It will have a disastrous effect on military operations. And the future was, as Dr. Pant rightly said, it will definitely be about rolling down the fifth generation aircrafts, but will also be about disabling radars, degrading network-centric warfare capacities, and that's what we must keep in mind and ensure that these companies are not a part of Indian networks.
And that also requires a certain amount of imagination on the part of our babus, for which is a subject quite alien to them, to be able to sit down again and rewrite the rules on how you get in companies and not be obsessed with that lowest bidder L1 factor. But I want to ask you, Harsh, an equally important question, and that is that the US continues to keep saying that as far as the US is concerned, they've got laws that if US interests are threatened, even through cyber areas, US will regard that as an act of war or matters to that effect. And the US is also very heavily engaged with China in a variety of areas, but they also know that maybe another 20, 25 years down the line, China clearly wants to unsettle it and take away the position as the supremely most powerful country in the world. And there is the Russia factor in American thinking in terms of cyber attacks. So is that what now we are all going to see? And is that going to finally replace the big arms trade business that has been there for so long? And we have the dubious distinction of being the largest arms importer.
It seems like that. I think the conversations in the West, in particular in Washington, has been shaken up by Mr. Trump. And to his credit, he has been the first to say that, look, we need to take China very, very seriously, especially the tech element of what is happening. And I think then to raise the bar by imposing tariffs and then to forcing China to negotiate. And if you look at it very carefully, what China is doing is very interesting. It is targeting the weaker parties. In the case of Canada, all the retaliation, what you mentioned, Huawei's CFO's arrest, all the retaliation is against Canada. Whereas the real force behind this is America. With America, they are saying we will cooperate. They are opening up their markets. They are giving them access to agriculture, etc. So it's very interesting how they are playing this game. They want to have a modus vivendi with the Americans, so that for the time being, they are on the same page. They are engaging with the global superpower, even as they catch up with that global superpower. And I think that's the game. Americans have recognized it. I think it's high time India recognizes that too.
Right. So very clearly, we are now entering into a stage in international relations where cyber threats and cyber security and cyber challenges are the big ones that we need to prepare for. It is also very obvious that it is perhaps China versus the rest of the world, and in terms of China wanting to catch up, but the rest of the world being equally worried and sounding the alarm against Chinese activities. But how easy will it be for either the West or for India to wean away from the attraction of cheap Chinese technology, which continues to take roots in all economies, particularly in India, where the obsession is to get the cheapest bidder to be given the contracts, whether for CCTVs or phones or radio networks or rail networks or whatever. But most importantly, while India has created at least the initial part of a cyber command, but there is still a lot of turf battles that are being fought and have to be fought to sort out how India would actually co-opt cybersecurity both into our national security and into our financial, economic, and energy security, all of which are equally important for India if India has to be secure and sovereign. Thank you very much for being with us on this show, and thanks for all your wisdom. We could have discussed this more, but perhaps on another day. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, goodbye and thank you.